Keep my files in order. Always have. Not because anyone asked me to. Not because there was a policy. Just because I learned a long time ago that the people who survive in this industry are not the ones who talk the loudest in meetings. They are the ones who can pull out a piece of paper and say, "Here, I wrote this down, and I wrote it down on this date, and here's the signature at the bottom." 22 years in supply chain compliance for a mid-size pharmaceutical distributor in Ohio. Not glamorous. Nobody writes articles about people like me. I was the person who made sure our cold chain protocols held up when the FDA came knocking. I was the person who flagged expired carrier certifications before they became audit findings. My name showed up in exactly 0 press releases and in every single corrective action plan that kept this company from losing its distribution license. That was fine with me. I am not built for the spotlight. I am built for the detail work. My wife used to joke that I probably documented our wedding in a 3-ring binder. She is not wrong. I did write down the vendor names, the contract terms, the deposit amounts. She found it years later and laughed until she cried. I told her that binder saved us $400 when the florist tried to charge us for an extra arrangement we never ordered. She stopped laughing and said, "You know what? Keep doing that." So I did. For 22 years, I kept doing that. The new CFO came in on a Tuesday in March. I remember the day because I had just come back from a site visit in Pittsburgh. 16-hour drive round trip, 2 days of documentation review, a corrective action report sitting half-finished on my desk. I walked into the building and there was a facilities announcement on the board about a company-wide meeting at 2 o'clock to introduce new senior leadership. His name was Dominic Farrell, 41 years old. Came out of a private equity firm in Chicago. Before that, 2 years at a healthcare consulting company. Before that, a few years in financial advisory. The kind of resume that reads like someone spent their career building the skills to talk about running things without ever actually running anything. He walked into that 2 o'clock meeting in a jacket that cost more than my monthly car payment, smiled at everyone like he already knew he was going to be your favorite person in the room, and spent 45 minutes talking about operational transformation and lean efficiency culture and getting the right people in the right seats on the bus. I noticed he did not mention compliance once. Not once. I wrote that down. Within 3 months, Dominic had reorganized the logistics division, replaced 2 senior operations managers with outside hires he brought in himself, and started a cost reduction initiative that he called, and I am not making this up, the Velocity Protocol. The Velocity Protocol was, in substance, this: move shipments faster, document less, and stop letting the compliance team slow things down. He did not say it that way in the memo, of course. The memo talked about streamlining approval workflows and reducing redundant verification steps. But I had been doing this work for over 2 decades. I knew what those phrases meant when you stripped away the consulting language. They meant, stop asking so many questions and just ship the product. I requested a meeting with him. His assistant put me on the calendar for 2 weeks out. I showed up on time. He was 17 minutes late, came in still on his phone, sat down without putting the phone away, and said, "What's the issue?" I walked him through 4 specific scenarios where the Velocity Protocol would create regulatory exposure, carrier certifications that required 48-hour verification before accepting cold chain product, temperature excursion documentation that had to be reviewed and signed before a lot could be released, chain of custody protocols that existed not because of internal policy but because of our DEA registration. He listened, or he approximated listening. The phone went face down on the desk about 4 minutes in, which I took as a partial improvement. When I finished, he said, "Okay, so the question is, are any of these things that have actually caused us a problem in the past?" I said, "No, because we follow them." He smiled. The kind of smile that is not really a smile. "Right. So maybe we consider that we have some room to move here," I said. "With respect, the FDA does not consider regulatory requirements to be things you have room to move on." He said, "I appreciate the perspective," and stood up, which is a way of saying the meeting was over. I went back to my desk and wrote a memo documenting the substance of that conversation. I dated it, saved it to our compliance shared drive, and CC'd our general counsel. I thought that would be the end of it. It was not the end of it. Over the next 4 months, the Velocity Protocol rolled out in pieces. Some of it I managed to push back on through the general counsel's office. Some of it I escalated to our VP of operations, a man named Gerald who had been with the company almost as long as I had and who was, to his credit, uncomfortable with what he was seeing. But Gerald reported to Dominic now, and Dominic had the ear of the board because the board cared about one thing above everything else, which was the acquisition offer that had come in from a regional health system network in December. The company was being acquired, or potentially acquired. The deal was in due diligence, and Dominic had been brought in specifically to make the financials look as attractive as possible before the close. I want you to understand what that means because it matters for everything that comes after. When a company is in acquisition due diligence, every metric matters. Operational costs matter. Revenue per shipment matters. Efficiency ratios matter. And if you have a compliance department that is pumping the brakes on shipment velocity, that shows up in the numbers as an inefficiency. It shows up as a cost center that is slowing down the business. Dominic needed me to stop pumping the brakes. I needed to pump the brakes. That was the whole problem right there. In September, I found something that changed everything. I was reviewing carrier payment reconciliation. Not technically my department, but it touched our certification records, so I had cross-visibility, and I found a pattern I did not like. 3 carriers had been paid at full contract rate for shipments they had not completed within spec. Specifically, temperature excursion events had occurred during transit. The carriers were required by contract to take a penalty deduction, and the deductions had not been applied. The overpayments totaled across 6 months just under $400,000. Now, $400,000 is not nothing, but in the context of a company our size, it is not immediately alarming. Accounting errors happen. Contract reconciliation is complicated. What alarmed me was that all 3 of these carriers were on a preferred vendor list that Dominic had introduced as part of the Velocity protocol. And when I pulled the approval chain for the original vendor contracts, I found his signature. And when I pulled the original bid documentation to see how these 3 carriers had been selected over incumbent vendors who had lower excursion rates and better compliance histories, I found something that should not have been there. A consulting invoice from a firm called Farrell Meridian Group, paid by our company to an outside consulting firm for carrier network analysis services. $60,000. The invoice was buried in a facilities expense line item in Q2, Farrell Meridian Group. I sat with that for a while. Then I typed the name into a business registration database. The registered agent of Farrell Meridian Group was a woman named Patricia Farrell. Same last name. The billing address was a condo in the River North neighborhood of Chicago. I did not jump to conclusions. I want to be clear about that because it would have been very easy to start making accusations at that point. But I am a compliance professional. I know the difference between a red flag and a finding. A red flag means you keep digging. A finding means you have documentation. I kept digging. Over the next 3 weeks, I pulled every document I could access through legitimate channels, carrier contracts, payment records, the original vendor selection analysis, internal emails I had been CC'd on that mentioned the new preferred carrier program. I also did something I had been doing quietly for 2 years at that point, which is something I want to explain carefully because it is the part of the story that people find hardest to believe. When the Velocity protocol launched, I had started a practice. Every email I sent or received that touched on compliance, carrier certification, shipment documentation, or vendor selection, I CC'd our external regulatory consultant. Her name is Nora, and she had been on retainer with us since the FDA audit 4 years prior. She was not an employee, she was an outside expert, and she had a mailbox that was not on our internal server. I had started doing this not because I was planning for anything in particular. I had started doing it because I had a feeling, the kind of feeling you develop after 2 decades in this work, that someday someone was going to try to tell a story about what happened in this company, and I wanted there to be a second copy of the real story somewhere that they could not touch. 2 years of emails. Every relevant thread. Sitting in Nora's external mailbox, time-stamped, unaltered, beyond anyone's reach. I did not tell Dominic this. I did not tell Gerald. I did not tell anyone inside the company. I just kept doing my job and kept CC'ing Nora. I brought everything I had found to Gerald in the 3rd week of October. I put a 22-page memo on his desk. I walked him through the carrier payment discrepancies, the Farrell Meridian invoice, the business registration, the timeline. Gerald sat across from me and read the whole thing without saying a word. When he finished, he looked up and said, "Are you sure about this?" I said. "I am sure about what the documents say. I am not making any legal conclusions. That is above my pay grade." Gerald nodded slowly. Then he said, I have to take this to Dominic. I said, Gerald, if there is a conflict of interest at the CFO level, taking it to the CFO is not the right first step. He said, I understand that, but I work for him. I cannot go around him. That night I went home and talked to my wife. She listened to the whole thing at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a coffee mug. When I finished, she said, What does your gut tell you? I said, My gut tells me Gerald is going to tell Dominic, and Dominic is going to figure out a way to make this about me. She said, Then you need to protect yourself before that happens. The next morning, I called an employment attorney. His name is not important for this story, but what he told me is, he looked at my employment contract, the one I had signed 11 years prior when I was promoted to my current role, and he pointed to a clause that I had negotiated into that contract myself, back when the previous CFO had offered me a lateral move that I turned down. In exchange for staying in my role and accepting a lower salary adjustment than I had asked for, I had gotten a provision written into my agreement. It said, in plain language, that I could not be terminated for cause without a documented performance review process that included a written warning, a 60-day remediation period, and a second review before any termination action was taken. The clause also said that if I was terminated in violation of that process, I was entitled to 18 months of salary continuation, full benefits for the same period, and reimbursement of reasonable legal fees and any action to enforce the agreement. I had forgotten about that clause. If I am being honest, it had been 11 years. I had not thought about it since the ink dried. My attorney read it and said, This is extremely clean drafting. Did you have a lawyer write this? I said, I wrote it myself. He looked at me over the top of his glasses. I said, I read a lot of contracts. He said, Whoever you were negotiating with 11 years ago was not paying close enough attention. He was right. They were not. Gerald told Dominic on a Thursday. I know because Dominic called me into his office on Friday morning. He was not in the performing charisma mode this time. He sat behind his desk and there was a woman from HR in the corner who did not introduce herself. The minute told me that there had been concerns raised about my performance. He told me that I had developed a reputation for being obstructionist. He told me that the compliance function under my leadership had become a bottleneck that was costing the company significant operational efficiency, and that this had been a documented concern for some time. I sat very still and I let him finish. Then I said, Can you show me the documentation? He said there would be a formal process. I said, I would like to see the written warnings I should have received as part of that process. There was a pause. I said, I asked because my employment agreement specifies a remediation process that has to occur before any termination action can be taken. I just want to make sure we are following that process correctly. The HR woman in the corner shifted in her seat. Dominic said, Nobody is talking about termination. I said, I understand. I just want us to be on the same page about the process. He told me to go back to my desk. I went back to my desk and emailed my attorney. The termination letter arrived 12 days later. It cited performance concerns. It cited failure to adapt to the company's operational direction. It cited, and I am using their exact language here, an ongoing pattern of adversarial conduct towards senior leadership. There was no written warning in my file. There was no documented remediation period. There was no second review. They had not followed the process, not one step of it. I forwarded the letter to my attorney. He called me within the hour and said, They just handed us the case. I said, I know. He said, Do you want to pursue this? I said, I want to pursue the other thing, the thing we talked about. Because there was something else happening, something bigger than my termination. 2 days after I gave my memo to Gerald, I had sent a separate detailed report to the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower. I had sent a copy to the FDA's MedWatch Safety Reporting Division regarding the cold chain compliance issues. And I had sent a packet to the State Board of Pharmacy with jurisdiction over our Ohio distribution license. My attorney had reviewed all 3 submissions before I sent them. I had also sent Nora, my external consultant with 2 years of CC'd emails, a formal request to preserve all correspondence and make it available if requested by any regulatory authority. I did this quietly. I did not tell Gerald. I did not tell anyone inside the company. I just did it, the same way I had always done my job. Methodically, without announcement. The due diligence process for the acquisition collapsed in November. I learned about it through a former colleague who was still inside the company. The acquiring health system had received, through channels I was not directly told about, a notification that the company was under regulatory review. The deal went on pause. Then the deal went away entirely. The SEC contacted our company's general counsel in December. The FDA issued a records request in January. Dominic Farrell was placed on administrative leave in February, 9 weeks after the termination letter they had sent me. I know the timeline because my attorney received a call from the company's outside litigation counsel in February asking about a possible resolution. The call did not go the way the litigation counsel expected. My attorney had my employment contract, the termination letter, the record of no written warnings, and 2 years of preserved external emails documenting a pattern of compliance issues that I had flagged and been ignored on. He told me afterward that when he laid everything out, there was a long silence on the other end of the phone. That silence lasted about 6 seconds, which in legal negotiation is approximately the equivalent of the other side falling down a very long flight of stairs. I want to stop here and tell you something that I think gets missed in stories like this. I was not trying to be a hero. I was not trying to take anyone down. I am a 53-year-old man from Dayton, Ohio, who has spent his career making sure pharmaceutical products are stored at the right temperature and documented correctly so that nobody gets hurt. That is the work. That is what I care about. When I started CCing Nora 2 years before any of this came to a head, I was not building a case. I was just not willing to let the record of what actually happened disappear, because I have seen that happen. I have watched people who did everything right get buried under a story that someone with more power wrote after the fact. And I decided, a long time ago, that was not going to happen to me. It is not clever. It is not dramatic. It is just a choice you make every day about whether you are going to document what is real or whether you are going to let someone else write the story. I chose to document what was real. The settlement came in April. I am not going to share the specific numbers because they are confidential and my attorney would be very unhappy with me. What I can tell you is that the employment contract clause, the one I had drafted myself 11 years earlier, the one the previous leadership had signed without apparently reading it closely, performed exactly as written. 18 months of salary continuation, full benefits, legal fees. The regulatory proceedings are ongoing and not mine to speak to specifically. What I can say is that the information I provided was, in the words of the response I received from one of the agencies, material to the investigation. I went back to work in the fall. Different company. Similar role. The first thing I did when I got my new employment agreement was read every clause 3 times and negotiate 2 new provisions into it. My wife watched me do this at the kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon. She had her coffee. I had a red pen and a printed contract. After a while, she said, "You know, most people just sign those things." I said, "Most people get surprised later." She shook her head slowly, but she was smiling. Dominic Farrell's LinkedIn profile went quiet in the spring. The last update before it went dark was a job title change in March. I did not look very hard. I am not interested in what happens to him. I am interested in the cold chain protocols at my new company, which are solid, and the carrier certification process, which I have already improved in 2 ways since I started. Gerald sent me an email in the summer. Short, he said he was sorry he had not handled it differently. He said he had not known what Dominic was going to do. I wrote back and I told him I believed him. I do believe him. Gerald is a decent man who was put in an impossible position and made a call that I would not have made, but I am not carrying that. The thing that I keep coming back to is this. Nobody gave me any of what I got. I did not get lucky. I did not have a friend in a powerful place who made a call on my behalf. What I had was 22 years of doing the work correctly, a clause in a contract that I had written myself because I understood the value of written agreements, and 2 years of emails in an external mailbox that nobody thought to account for. That is not a revenge story. That is just what happens when you decide, once and for all, that you are going to be the person who keeps the receipts. I will close with this because I know some of you watching this are in a situation right now. Maybe not as dramatic as mine, maybe just a manager who takes credit for your work, or a company that is moving the goalposts on a performance review. Maybe something much worse. Here is what I would tell you. Start now. Not when things go wrong. Now. Every email that matters, keep a copy somewhere you control. Not the company server, somewhere you control. Every conversation that has consequences, follow up with a written summary to the other party. Just wanted to confirm what we discussed. Every commitment, every agreement, every instruction that contradicts a policy. Write it down. Date it. Store it. Read your employment contract, all of it. If there are things in there that do not protect you, ask for things that do. They may say no, but they may not. 11 years ago, a CFO who was busy and not paying attention said yes to a clause that I had written myself. That clause paid for my daughter's first semester of college. You do not have to be loud. You do not have to fight. You just have to be the person in the room who knows exactly what the paper says. The paper will do the rest. Ever found yourself in a situation where doing your job correctly put a target on your back? Drop it in the comments. I read everyone. And if you found this useful, subscribe and hit the bell. There are more of these stories coming, and they are all real and they are all documented. I have thought about this a lot in the months since everything settled. Not obsessively. Just the way you think about something when it keeps showing you something true every time you turn it over. What happened to me and what happened to Dominic was not luck running in opposite directions. It was something simpler and more mechanical than that. It was the result of choices made consistently over a long period of time, compounding quietly in the background while everyone was busy looking somewhere else. I chose, every single day for 2 years, to copy Nora on emails that nobody told me to copy her on. Nobody assigned me that task. Nobody would have known if I had stopped. I did it because I had learned, not from a book, not from a mentor, just from 22 years of watching how things actually go wrong, that the record of what really happened has a way of disappearing when powerful people need it to. And I decided I was not going to let that happen to my record. That was not strategy. That was just a value I held about honesty and about protecting what was real. Dominic made different choices. He chose to route a consulting payment through an expense line where it would not be noticed. He chose to sign vendor contracts that favored carriers connected to his own financial interest. He chose to bring in a CFO role at a company in acquisition due diligence and treat the position as a personal opportunity rather than a professional responsibility. Every one of those choices was made freely, and every one of them left a mark in the record, the real record, not the one he thought was the only one. That is what I mean when I say this is not a revenge story. Revenge implies that I did something to Dominic. I did not do anything to Dominic. I documented what was real. I protected that documentation. I reported what I found to the appropriate authorities, and then I let the paper do what paper does when it is accurate and preserved and placed in front of people who were paid to read it carefully. The hard part was the in-between period, the weeks after Gerald told him what I had found. The days after the termination letter arrived, my wife and I sat at that kitchen table more than once during those months and talked through what we were looking at. If this did not go the way we hoped, there was real fear in those conversations, real uncertainty. I want to be honest about that because I think people who tell these stories sometimes make it sound like they were calm and certain the whole time. I was not calm and certain the whole time. I was a 53-year-old man who had just been fired after 22 years. And some mornings it was genuinely hard to get up and trust that what I had built was going to hold. What got me through was not confidence. It was the knowledge that I had done the work correctly. I had documented what was real. I had kept copies in a place no one could alter. I had an attorney review my submissions before I sent them. I had a clause in my contract, one I had written myself, one I had traded real money for 11 years earlier, that said exactly what it said. I had done the work, and I have learned, slowly, over the course of a long career, that the work you do when no one is paying attention is the only work that genuinely protects you when someone finally is. Gerald is a decent man who got caught between what he knew was right and what he felt he was able to do. I do not carry anger about that. What I carry is a clearer understanding of why you cannot outsource your own protection to people who have their own pressures and their own constraints. Gerald could not protect me. Not because he did not want to, because he was not in a position to. The only person who was ever going to protect me was me, and the choices I had been making quietly for years before anyone thought there was anything to worry about. That is the thing about integrity. It does not show up dramatically in one moment. It shows up in 1,000 small moments that nobody witnesses, and then one day it is the only thing standing between you and a version of events that someone else wrote. Build the record now. Not when you need it. Now.